couple of minutes for people to have a seat. Wonderful. So, good evening, everyone, both here and online. And thank you for joining us for another event in the Learning Curves series here at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. My name is Sotiria Grek. I work at the School of Social and Political Science, and I'm really happy to introduce the title for the event tonight on education and utopia. And I suspect there is no better place to discuss this topic than here, an institute that links together past, present, and future in order to contemplate what alternative possibilities there are in this crisis-stricken world. Indeed, last week's event was on education and crisis, and the word hope was about the one we were left with at the end of a fascinating discussion. So hope for a better future. My request from you today is to move beyond hope. In fact, to move towards desire. To think together and hopefully in your own time later on about the role, the potential of education to offer us and the planet an alternative future. Following Levitas, who is a key thinker in utopianism, I want to invite you to dream together. Not because we are daydreamers, though there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, but dream together so that we can then engage in political action that changes how we live today. For what is progress if it is not utopia? Not a blueprint, but really developing a common horizon. How to make the unthinkable thinkable and then plan for it. A few months ago, I was kind of standing in front of my students, suggesting to them that education is a door. For some, this door is wide open, while for others, just because of the lottery, I suppose, of their social background or postcode, this door might be a lot heavier to push open. But for most, the opportunity is there. This opportunity in education allows us not only to understand the world through that kind of solid door frame that in a sense gives us the parameters through which we kind of structure our existence, but it also allows us to move beyond this frame towards this open space of possibility, that open space of utopia. Because at this moment in time, living through an entirely human-made climate catastrophe, we see really an acceleration of utopian thinking, and once again, a turn to education for creating hope, change, survival even. Because we are truly facing an ultimatum. It really is about utopia or bust, as Benjamin Kunkel recently wrote. But practicing utopian thinking is neither about dealing with despair or about kind of building kind of castles in the sky. It is about holding a mirror and reflecting ourselves in it, reflecting education in it, and try to understand the ways that we, all of us, have, I suppose, always engaged with education as primarily an engine for growth, for competition, for creating surplus, extracting and in fact impoverishing not only one another, but the planet too. More recently, we experienced the rise of solutionism in education, big data, standardization, AI, quick sort of techno fixes, as if these will ever be able to replace teachers. And I suppose the beauty of this moment of coming together in an interaction where I have just given a little tap to this door of yours, and you're all here with us in order free, to choose your own horizon and your own utopia. So together with our 3 distinguished guests, whom I will introduce in a moment, I am requesting you to do what utopian thinkers do, to recount your own story in education as you experience it. And I am using present tense here, experience, as education, of course, does not stop when you finish school or even when you graduate. What are your realities of education, of pushing these doors, of tripping over sometimes, but also these moments of liberation, if you like, those small moments of utopia when anything feels possible, when anything, in fact, becomes possible. So helping us take that journey tonight are our wonderful guests and utopian storytellers, 3 different women from 3 different continents of the same, more or less, generation, I suppose, recounting education and utopia, both in their personal but also their professional lives. I'll start first with Koumbou Boly Bari, joining us online from Barat in Morocco. Koumbou is the advisor of the Director General of UNESCO. She's a United Nations former special rapporteur on the right to education, and also former Minister of Education and Literacy of Burkina Faso. She has consulted widely for various governments and international institutions on the right to education. Second, I have the pleasure to welcome Radhika Gorur, who is Associate Professor in the School of Education at Deakin University in Australia. Radhika's research spans education policy and reform, global aid and development in education, data, accountability, and lots more. Radhika is a founding director of the Lab of International Assessment Studies, convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network, and also a founding member of the International Studies Network. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome Joelle Taylor, and really to take this opportunity to also thank Sean Bain for introducing me to Joelle's work and to Joelle herself. Joelle is the author of 4 collections of poetry and 1 novel. Her more recent collection, Canto and Other Poems, won the 2021 T.S. Eliot Prize and the 2022 Polarized Book Prize for LGBT authors. She's also a poetry fellow of the University of East Anglia and the curator of the Kostler Awards 2023, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the 2022 Saboteur Spoken Word Artist of the Year. So welcome to all 3 of you. And what we'll try to do in our conversation together is really use what academics would call, I suppose, the biographical method. This is really a fancy term to really say that we'll try to use and understand our own stories and, in a sense, connect these personal stories to the political. So I'll just kick off our discussion, if I may, by asking my first question to the 3 panelists. And I'll start with you, Radhika, and we can go around. I suppose if we were to go back to these early years of schooling, perhaps all the way to kind of university education, can you really tell us, if you like, the story of those moments of where you found education offering you that space to develop opportunity and liberation? Or also, it would be interesting to also hear of, maybe moments of, oppression or discipline that we know also that schooling is very often about. So I'll just pass over. Thank you.
Thanks, Sotiria, and thanks for the wonderful opportunity actually today. I grew up in a very small town in India, and the school I went to was the school that the factory where my dad worked had organized for the for the children of all the workers, everybody from the officers that were higher up to the, any worker. And it was an English medium school. And until you asked me the question, I hadn't actually reflected on how beautifully this ambitious English medium school in the middle of, a place where English was not anybody's language, was struggling to create this air of, we all wore pinafores, and we studied out of English medium books taught by teachers who were not very good at speaking English. But it was seen as some kind of a passport out of, that could get you out of that place and get you opportunities, anywhere in the world. We were very proud of it. Our school motto was knowledge is power. And there was this whole air of, we were a little bit superior because we went to the English medium school, and there was the government school that taught in Telugu, which is, because I was in the state where that was the mother tongue. And so I find, when I think back on it, this paradox of where we were trying to gain some advantage, but in a situation that made us very mediocre because none of us, was really at home in this language. And there's also this whole business of the Enlightenment kind of story, because I'm assuming this is all kind of like hangover from colonialism, because progress was, the progress and development was language there. And so we were all trying to emulate that. And we felt that, that would combat all the superstition and, ignorance that surrounded us. So when I think back on the schooling that happened there, I feel that a lot of the confusion I feel in relation to my work in understanding development comes from this confusion, because on the one hand, it was indeed the case. Look at me, I'm sitting here in Edinburgh, from that little place, invited by your Futures Institute, which I would not have been able to do had I not, got that education. But it was also the very thing, this ambition. Is that me? It's doing that? Okay. This ambition to kind of move forward was also kind of, in a way, I don't know how much better my teachers would have been if they had been allowed to teach in their native language. So that was my schooling. With my university, I went to university in Bangalore, and I studied sociology and psychology and literature, which I enjoyed. It was fine. But I went from the little village into the big city, into the kind of metropolis, and had to learn everything, including like shifting from eating with my fingers to using a knife and fork. And so it was like quite an extraordinary, change. It made me really learn how to watch and observe and, kind of pick up what I'm supposed to do. And then I went after that I did a graduate diploma in mass communication. And I think that's when my mind was really blown, because all of a sudden we were, learning about cinema and about, TV, journalism. And more than anything else, I think it was that we were not just learning something that was already known. We had to create, we had to perform, and it was just an extraordinary experience. And I think that has guided much of my teaching and other work as well.
Yeah. I love that, how you kind of, in a sense, you bring the two so closely together, that notion of schooling as a place of oppression, I suppose, given the fact that you were in India but had to speak English, had to wear pinafore, all the rest of it. But at the same time, it was really the place of opportunity and kind of opening yourself out to a much bigger world, yeah.
But I just want to say that what was strange was that we were doing all of this, but we also had this sense of national pride, and we were also learning our languages and our literature as well. So that was that was what was interesting about that space.
Yeah. Interesting. Joelle, can you?
Yeah, that was such an interesting story and an insight into how you became a teacher, that creativity. And it was a similar experience with me. So I can't remember school until I was 9 years old. I come from quite a difficult background as a very traumatized child. And my parents would move from area to area with every kind of 18 months, it seemed to me. So I didn't have any roots. I didn't have any sense of kind of friendships that you develop, which I think are an essential part of our education, that social kind of contact and community. And then, at 9 years old, I went to this school, Bacup Thorne Juniors, and it's a place called Lancashire. So again, it's back then, Lancashire was a long way from London, and it was a very kind of insular community, and I was finding it difficult to fit in. I was quite a sparky, but I don't come from the environment where necessarily education was valued. Certainly not within my family very much. Both my parents were like bad girls, bad boys at school, so they didn't really, didn't really push me. And then I was leaving school one day and I had all kinds of fights. I used to get into fights all the time because I was finding it difficult to connect. And a teacher stopped me on a Friday afternoon as I was leaving and gave me a photograph. And on the photograph, it was quite a dark photo actually looking back, but it was a pair of feet that had shackles on them, and then there was mud in the background. I can still remember it now, almost 40 years later. And all he said to me was, "Joelle, you like words, don't you? I want you to write me a story and bring it back on Monday." And I did this. I brought it back to him, and then he put it around the school hall. And that was the moment that I became who I am at 9 years old. He didn't teach me how to write. He taught me meaning, and he taught me place and purpose, which were the things holistically I needed at that time. I couldn't learn because I couldn't keep still. Yeah. I couldn't settle. But he taught me that the pen is a compass, and it always points to true north. So I knew that wherever I went, I would have this thing, which would enable me to move through the studies. But as I moved through, into secondary school, I was still finding it very difficult in lots of ways. So I was high achieving, but a very low emotional literacy, shall we say. I was very sparky. And eventually I was permanently excluded. And that moment actually weirdly, which I think they shouldn't have done it, but anyway, that weirdly gave me the determination to go on and get a degree and work towards which is what I did. And once I got to university, the education started to be more about how I naturally was. So there's a lot more freedom in learning, a lot more time to go away and read about, go to the library, find out about this subject. And I did a 4-year degree. So at the end, they just left me alone for a year to create 3 plays, whatever way I could, and a dissertation. And that was the thing I learned that was really helpful. I needed to belong, and I needed to have that social structure, and then the freedom to go out and learn. So for me, that's formed the basis of how I've worked in education, as a poet, is to try and tell them about the pen and how useful it is and how it links people.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a great story, and I think we all can associate to this the fact of the role of the teacher, and these teachers that we really like, and very often we worked because they kind of believed in us and we believed in them, and it's such a fundamental role that they play. But very interesting. Koumbou, should I turn to you? I know you had a fantastically interesting story of how you actually accessed education in the first place. Do you want to share it with us?
Yes, with pleasure. It's really, as I used to say here, Assalamu alaikum. That means peace upon to you. On the behalf of His Excellency, the Director General of UNESCO, I really wanted to say thank you for inviting me. And I would like to say again, it was really a pleasure to be with you and your team. And thank you for organizing this wonderful event in Edinburgh University, which is really an innovative one and also with a deep historical legacy. I'm really proud to be with the team. For my perspective, when I'm really talking about schooling, for the primary school, I was in a little village, and I am from a nomadic group. That means my ethnic group, they are really pastoralists. They have cows, and they move in the year somehow from land to land. And my grandfather was a chief of a village, and at this moment, they need to give a child at school. the first time, they sent my great sister. And when she was there, my mom asked her, please, if you go, cry, and they will let you come home. And this is what all the nomadic kids are doing during this time, because for them, it is not their culture, it is not their tradition, it is not their language. And for them, going to modern school is like losing everything for the ethnic group. But as my granddad is really a chief of a village, the administration obliged him to give a child. Donc, after my big sister, it was me. When they took me at school, I can assure you, for me, the key driver who makes me stay at school is my teacher. He was absolutely a wonderful person who decided to use and to show kids how to make a choice. He told me, you know, this is my lady. It was his wife. And his wife was really a beautiful woman who is a doctor in this village. And he told me, you know, you can have a choice between going to Herda or coming to be to become a doctor. And I'm just saying, to be a doctor is really to help people. It's good to, you know, to make people healthy. And for me, I think this can be my choice. And really, as a little child, this was my choice. And when I go home, my parents keep telling me, please, you have to cry at school and they will let you go home. But I never do, because I decided to make a choice. And this is the teacher who really gave me this choice. I just want to say that this is sometimes, this is one driver really for education. And I think it's very important. This is really perhaps many years ago, decades ago, but this continue or even today. How, if you have a good teacher in a classroom or in a university, I'm sure the student or the learners will be absolutely happy to learn, and they will learn very well. And I think this drives me the whole of my life, you know, to be to be committed. When I was really in secondary school, I had a chance to be in boarding schools, and inside I try to make the other girls who are in my village to go to school. I just push my dad to help him, telling him, please, you are the chief of a village. Now I am here. I need also others. And he keep telling me, yes, yes, I will do. And some has absolutely gone. So this is really my story when I was young, and after when I was in university. Really, it was really a wonderful moment because we have really, I have to leave Burkina and go to Senegal, and after in Paris for my PhD. And it's these opportunities of, you know, meeting people, but also continuing to see how you can make a choice, but also how you are able to support others to continue in this way. Donc, just really a few words, because I know it's we need to to continue, but yeah, just to share these things.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
The point around utopia and political action. It's kind of these little moments that, your moment with the teacher and how, they gave you the pen and kind of the picture and ask you to write a story, or kind of being in that English medium school and kind of showing the different perspectives. Or with you, Koumbou, this idea of how your family, I suppose, and then the teacher bringing, their partner in the school as a role model, all these different little actions, if you like, in very difficult circumstances, I suppose, for all of you, for all of us, still kind of gives us this, the opportunity to use education to actually create a different alternative future, I suppose, to the one most of the people around you, had. Lovely. I mean, I just want to kind of continue to take us through this journey, because I think it's really interesting in the fact that in your professional lives, you have then found yourself working in education, right? And in a sense, the opportunities that were given to you, in your earlier years, in your youth, to actually engage with education, then you found yourselves being in a position of authority, I suppose, to an extent, in order to pass them on to others. And if you like, the little utopia moments that you yourself experienced, to give also others the opportunity to experience too. So if I turn to you, Radhika, in terms of your sort of academic work, I suppose, your teaching and finding yourself as a university educator, where do you place your work and your contribution, I suppose, in relation to kind of creating the possibility for people to think critically, think differently, think alternatively, if you like, about the present and the future?
So actually, I have to say that before I came into academia, I had a very long career as a teacher. And I taught across different systems, and I taught across different continents. But I did most of it without any training as a teacher. So I just happened to find myself in Nigeria with a degree in mass communication, but no degree in teaching. And next thing I knew, I was 21 years old, and I thought I could do anything I wanted. I think at my age, I still do it, still kind of believe that. But there I started teaching, and I found that everything I'd learned in communication was useful in teaching. And I loved, and I fell in love with it. I'd worked in advertising briefly, but I just fell in love with teaching after that. And the extraordinary thing I learned was that it didn't matter, because I taught across different systems and in different continents, I felt that your curriculum that you teach actually doesn't matter so much. I felt because we were learning different things in different places and really, learning similar things. But I found that learning how children thought was really important for teachers. And I felt that those conversations with children were actually very, very key. And in fact, a lot of my early research also came from that, work of how do you respond to, what you hear from students. It was only much later that I did my PhD in education policy, and then my work has been looking at policy. I think if I look at, in a way, this idea of deciding what is good for you, right? That's been a question that has puzzled us. I think your work as well, because we've looked at policies made by global organizations for other people, for other countries, and then deciding, how do you evaluate what is good, and how to make better policy or how to make better practices and so on. And I think that probably because of being in that paradoxical situation of thinking that English medium was good, or Western education, or that those aspirations were right, and maybe that discomfort, which I don't remember feeling that discomfort as a child, but it must have been somewhere, that my work with looking at OECD, PISA and the accountability measures that kind of put in place, but now much more so with UNESCO and the SDGs and so on. This idea of trying to figure out how to improve education, and then you say who decides what is good education that you're going to improve towards. But also if you don't decide, because it's also true that there are many, many children going to school. Parents are sending their children to school a lot more than ever before, right? Because now it's because of the right to education and because of compulsory education and so on. So how do you decide that that the education they're getting is actually, what they're looking for, or and so on? And I feel that those accountability measures that on the one hand, I feel are extremely important, but on the other hand, I can also see the way they're being practiced are being so perverse. So I think that's the kind of the paradox that has continued to dog the questions that I'm asking. And a lot of my students also work in that same space. So I have a number of my students looking at, say, North-South relations in say, teacher education, or looking at, universities in a place like Pakistan, or looking at UNESCO's, initiatives working with big tech to improve education globally, and so on. So I think these questions have continued to kind of engage me and my students. And I think in all of this, what I've tried to do and what I've tried to kind of encourage my students to do as well is to not come up with a simple answer, because the questions are not simple, and to have the patience to kind of think about the complexity of things, not to very easily do the dichotomous thing of saying, Western bad, indigenous good kind of thing, because this idea of what is local, I feel, has changed completely. And I think when I think back again to the place where I grew up, and to think that actually that was the local aspiration. It wasn't simply, it might have been the colonial legacy, but it was still, it was still local. It was, Yeah. So I think those paradoxes, I think, are important for us to kind of keep in mind, and that's what I try to kind of bring to my work and help. Kind of encouraging my students as well.
Yeah. If I may say, and you also do it really, really well in your work, in terms of problematizing really a very complex and difficult situation, education being simultaneously needing to, yes, of course, improve economic prosperity and therefore reduce inequalities, but at the same time kind of, create opportunities to actually think critically, to think alternatively, especially in the present moment that we are. And we know where this kind of focus on growth, prosperity, standardization in education, where it has brought us, and the fact that we need to maybe question some of these givens, I suppose. Joelle, I know you worked a lot with schools, and it's really fascinating that, you as a poet was going into schools. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about these spaces?
So was never a teacher, or I have lectured and things, but I've got no qualifications whatsoever. But I did win a poetry slam back in 2000. A slam is, you know what a slam poetry is? It's the competitive art of performance poetry, rapping, MCing, whatever. And I won it. And as a consequence, the Mayor of London at the time, Ken Livingstone, asked me if I would kind of take on a new competition, a new kind of competition. And I said, have you heard about slam poetry? They're queuing up for it. So we organised the very first London Slam Championships through the Poetry Society. And this is the start of something that lasted 18 years. So just take you back to that first moment. I had no idea what I was doing. But listening to you, Radhika, the most valuable thing I think you said is about teaching how to think, how to apply critical thought. For me, it was a companion to that. I was teaching how to feel. This kind of sense of empathy as a root of knowledge and learning. So I did the first slams, and I talent scouted across London schools. So it's all the bad boys, all the bad girls, all the MCs, all the kids who were failing, all the kids from the ends who kind of wanted to be part of this thing or pushed forward by their schools. And I thought it was only going to last kind of one session. But what happened backstage was so incredible and so overwhelming that these unteachable kids, these unreachable children, reached each other and began to kind of make connections with one another. The confidence that they developed because of having their writing looked at and being able to, not just looked at, but being put on a stage and having that sense of radical, deep listening you get in these kind of events, meant that suddenly the kids were teaching each other. And eventually it became known as Slambassadors, and it became a national project, and I ran it for 18 years. So that was kind of my route in, but as a part of that as well, I became poet in residence for the prison system. So I've done a lot of work with inmates in various prisons, and also worked in primary schools as a poet in residence. And I'll just tell one tiny story about that before we move on. So I was employed, I won't say the school in case it's illegal, by this primary school, which was bottom of the league in Hackney. And it was bottom of the league essentially because the children were coming from very traumatic backgrounds. It was a school for a feeder estate, and a lot of the parents were coming from very, very difficult, disadvantaged backgrounds. And so they decided that since they'd all failed so completely to rethink education. And so they decided to teach everything through things the kids loved. So they were learning history and chemistry through music. They were learning politics through poetry, these creative entry points into the curriculum. And by the end of that first year, it got to second in the league. And because it's that sense of the bespoke education, you know. So that's it, really. I've just tried to introduce a sense of poetry being these small empathy machines, as Roger Robertson calls it, and again, to try to encourage critical thought, but also this emotional literacy, which I think is at the heart of being able to learn.
No, that's fantastic, and I really love the fact, of course, you would, talk about creativity and poetry, because again, I find, there is so much focus on these competencies around literacy, numeracy, these basic skills, and very often we forget, how important it is, for thinking alternative futures.
Creative thinking.
Exactly.
That's what we teach, how to approach problems creatively.
Exactly. And the incredible results that, the example of the school you mentioned achieved, just because they actually shifted the focus to something else than what would normally be done in a school.
Exactly that.
Fantastic. Koumbou, Radhika and Joelle kind of discussed, I suppose, how the personal, in a sense, became political and then action, through their work. With you, this became kind of literal. Like you went actually into politics, by becoming the Minister of Education and Literacy in Burkina Faso. Also, of course, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Education. Can you tell us a little bit about, first how you ended up in this working actually for policy, but also, of course, from your own perspective and your work in this area, how you approach, this, I suppose, difficult question of how you make this compromise of pushing for education, for improving, the economy, but also at the same time creating this space for actually think creatively, think, in alternative kind of new ways about actually, changing, if you like, the status quo.
Yes, absolutely wonderful to hear the two panelists before my speech, and I really appreciated how all of those questions of decolonizing education are really key and important. I'm just saying this because when I began as a teacher as a lecturer in university, in Ouagadougou University. And you have just to use French. And for people, for the basic, they never speak French. At the primary school, they have to begin by learning French. And the same for teachers. And after you have to continue in this way. And really, the background of a person, I think, is very important. I remember when I was really young, how it was hard for the kids to learn in French, because it is not their mother tongue. When I arrived in university, I begin saying, perhaps it will be good to think how to teach the teachers and how to be sure that in our methodology, we can have a bilingual methodology using African language, but also continuing to use, French and adding other language. This is one program I really built in university for adult learning in Ouagadougou University. And I'm really proud for this program. because we cooperate with Swiss cooperation, but also we cooperate with Brazil and Freiburg University. It was absolutely many students coming from Burkina, but also countries in Africa, and also other countries in the world for this program. And for me, it's really how to be sure that you are not letting people just learn what also the Western is telling us to learn, but to be sure that we are also framing with the culture, the tradition, and the history of people. This is really one thing I have done. And when I moved from university as a Minister of Education, I'm really, is this, I think sometimes, as I used to say, the background is very important. When I arrived, it is the things I already, I remember that the teacher are key. And I have seen in the context that is absolutely important to change the level of teachers, but also the training of trainers of teachers. If we want the quality of education, you have to change this and to give them a critical thinking, but also to be sure that they are able to use their own context and their own perspective in this process of teaching. And really to help the new teachers who are arriving and who has to begin in the rural area. I remember it was really a big challenge when I was the Minister of Education with World Bank and also with FMI. Because when I decided to say for the quality of education, we need to give more budget to education, but sincerely to be sure that we can have good material, but also good learning of teachers and how to motivate teachers in the rural area. World Bank begins telling to the government of Burkina Faso that yes, if you give even $1 for each teacher, it will be a big amount, and it's not good for the macro indicators for the country. What does that mean? This is economic vision of the society. And for me, really, it was a big challenge. And I have gone to the government and I tell to the Prime Minister and the President that if I am here as a Minister of Education to lead and to give strategical orientation for the Minister of Education to make quality and right to education for this country, this is my proposal. If it is not possible, I just have to say, I have to go. I remember the Prime Minister of my country is saying, no, you are now talking like civil society people. This is not acceptable. You are now a Minister of Education. You have not to have this kind of language. I say, no. This language is just a true language. It's just what I think. And it is how I feel. If I am in a government, the minimum, it is also to tell you what is important as an expert of education only, because this is my responsibility. You know what happened? I got this budget. And I'm telling you, from this day, all the teachers in Burkina, I have never strike during my whole 4 years of, ruling the Ministry of Education. But it's just how you build, confidence with people and take action for things who are really important. I think the second thing as a Minister of Education I have really done is also girls' education in rural area, to build girls' boarding schools, because this is absolutely key, because all the girls are really uh, uh, in the rural area, they are making domestic work, and it's never let them time to read or to learn their lessons, and they can't do anything, and we know that. And this is lessons learned from my own perspective, and I know. Don't, but sometimes we know things, and I don't ask sometimes myself, everywhere, if there is no political will, nothing will happen. This is also lessons I really learn, and I know, yes, if you have a good person at the good moment and the right place, things will change. But if you haven't, this will never change.
Thanks, Koumbou. I absolutely love, how your story from the start, how you as a girl, you were given the opportunity to have education, and then you found this incredible teacher that pushed you further, and how you brought, if you like, all these teachings from kind of these little utopia moments from your childhood into actually your political work as a Minister of Education. That's really wonderful. I suppose I'm coming towards kind of the last question, which is kind of the big question, the elephant in the room, as they say. And we'll kind of go around again, the panelists, but then we'll open it out to the audience, because this is really, as I said at the start, it's an interaction. It is about the discussion. It's about your own reflections, with education. And really, the question is about, at this moment in time where, people talk about the poly crisis, really with also climate catastrophe, as I mentioned at the very start, really being, I suppose, one of the main drivers for so much emphasis now in thinking about utopia and utopia futures, and how it's not just about some sort of speculative fiction or daydreaming, but it is really about the action that we need to take today if we are to survive on this planet. Radhika, what is your take? What are really the possibilities of using education as a space where utopia does not remain kind of a dream of a faraway land, somewhere in the future, but actually becomes political action for what we need to do today to make sure we have a future tomorrow?
Yeah, only a small question. Actually, I will go to some fiction to think about this. And I was actually thinking about Ursula Le Guin's story, called Those Who Left Omelas. And this is a story of, Omelas is like a fictitious, perfect society. Perfect in the sense that it was not that they had everything that they wanted. It was just that people were very happy. There were no priests, there was no government, there was no, kind of stratification of any kind. But they were just very happy people. And, and actually Ursula Le Guin doesn't actually tell us too much about that space, because she, I suppose, wants us to imagine, what utopia might be like, for ourselves. But she does tell us one detail, and the detail is that when people in this place, in Omelas, kind of grow up, they realize that there is one little child, a girl, in a basement somewhere, who is absolutely miserable and lives in like terrible conditions. And they come to realize that they can enjoy their utopia only as long as this child is, in that situation. And some people who realize that can't bear the thought, and they leave Omelas. And others feel that, well, it's a trade-off, and if we want to enjoy our utopia, and a small cost in the form of one child has to be paid, then that's how it is. Now, I just find this story so interesting on so many levels, so disturbing on so many levels, but also so real on so many levels. So in a way, I feel that searching for utopia, I think might come at a cost. In a way, if you think about all the things that we call progress, which is the utopia we've been searching for, has come at the cost of the planet. It's so paradoxical that it's like really shooting your foot, right? So that is one thing that I want to. I'll come back to in a minute. The other thing I learned when you asked me to talk about this, I looked up utopia, the word itself, and found that Actually, utopia spelled with a U apparently actually literally means no place. And I think that's from the Greek, right? And if you spell utopia with EU, then it means a good place or a perfect place. So in a way, they're both homonyms. They both sound the same, right? So utopia is at once both a perfect place and a no place. So in a way, I feel that maybe this search for perfection, it's like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I feel that maybe we should not be looking for this extraordinary education that's going to do all these amazing things, which, which will then assess and rank and monitor and, all of those kinds of things. And maybe we need just good enough education where I feel the most important thing is for people to realize that there are these kind of inequalities, that the things we enjoy are coming at a cost to somebody else, and where we kind of encourage people not to leave and go away, because actually we don't know what happens, what the people that left Omelas, we never know what those who left Omelas actually do. But to be able to encourage people to stay and to actually not forget or not accept that little girl has to be, has to bear the brunt for their own happiness, but to actually work through that, to understand the relations that cause these inequalities, and to feel you talked actually about feeling, and I felt that was such an important point, to have that ability to engage with this notion and to do something about it. And I think that should be the essence of a utopian education. So it might not be a perfect education, but it is this understanding of what it means actually to live in this world.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That's such a nice way of bringing all these different issues together and the complexity of the situation that we're in. Joelle?
I'll just say a very brief thing, because I've got a whole poem about this I'm going to read. But I'll just say that I gave a lot of thought to what is utopia in terms of education and how will we get there. And you said, I don't believe we can achieve it unless we have a complete restructuring of society, until we rethink capitalism, particularly this hyper-capitalism we've got at the moment, where, children are reduced to kind of like boxes on a factory line, everything's commodified. And once we introduce that, then we introduce this stratification that you were talking about. So that's all I'll say about it. I think it's got to be a holistic experience where everything changes. I'll just be quiet.
We had this discussion over coffee earlier, didn't we? Do we need to change everything, or can we start bit by bit?
The kind of oasis of utopian education is an amazing idea, but
Koumbou, very briefly, because I really want to open it out to the audience and have other people's perspectives.
Thank you. I think I will go quick, because all the colleagues have already said what is very, very important in this stage. For me, really, it's to say which kind of society we want, really. For me, this is the first thing we have really to think together and to agree together and to decide common values together because education is just, how to support, to build the society we want. And I think for me, this is really the first perspective. If we are able to sit together, if we are able to think together, and if we are able to decide together in a dialogue, and really a peaceful and transparent dialogue, I think we can build utopian societies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, in my readings around utopia, it's precisely about this kind of developing this common horizon. And I think, we focus maybe far too far on education as a project for individuals and, on kind of doing better, as individuals rather than as society. So, certainly we need a rethink. Okay, I think it's time to open it out to the audience, so we have some of your perspectives on this very, very large topic indeed. And then, of course, have time, for the main event, I suppose, which is really that's what we're expecting, the poem by Joelle. So, these slides are really, I can't really see very well, but if you raise your hand and then just wait for the microphone to reach you, it would be lovely to have some comments or questions. Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all of that. I think the three really varied experiences of education speaks to me, and I'll give you my opinion on Utopia, and basically my question is, what do you think on that? So my idea of Utopia, and I think you've all individually touched upon it, is all of those experiences were valuable for each of you. So when you talk about common values, absolutely, but a common educational experience surely is not Utopia for anybody. So having the different experiences of, Joelle, you found poetry, right? You found writing. That was your experience. If somebody made you meet those expectations for every single aspect of the education system, the whole curriculum, you probably wouldn't have thrived just as well. Or as you said, you didn't, right? So my idea of Utopia is all those different journeys being valued equally, whether you go into the creative arts, whether you go into the sciences, whether you go into politics, and everyone making their own journey. So I suppose my question in that sense is, one, do you agree? And two, how can we find ways to value all of those experiences equally, no matter what subject expertise you go into, when you find your passion and what that value is, and also where. I'm very aware, having taught internationally, that different locations, degrees, high school diplomas are valued differently around the world. And even if it's exactly what you said, Radhika, the curriculum's irrelevant. Like, you're learning the same stuff, but for some reason, if you come from one country and you've got the same degree as someone else, it's not seen as good in some places. So my question is, how do we value everything equally, even if everyone has a unique experience? And is that Utopia?
Thank you so much. And that really resonates with some of the comments that come from our online audience. Tom Todd is asking, how do we make progress in deciding whose knowledge counts in education? Are we achieving perceived epistemic justice in any areas? And Jennifer Haddad-Lingle is asking, belonging, mentioned through inclusion of language, identity, content, threads through these stories. How can we dream together to increase belonging?
I think this is this idea that there may be something seen as more valuable, or some knowledge seen as more valid, or all of those things, is the reason why I'm kind of almost rebelling against the idea of Utopia. That of course, it should not be a singular thing, and the singularity is in the multiplicity of it, and that's the paradox that I keep coming back to. So I really don't. I also have a bit of, maybe it's my, when I taught in very elite schools for quite a long time, international schools and so on, and it always bothered me a little bit about how we were encouraged to make every child feel special, and then build this idea that every child has a talent and that they're going to find their thing and so on. It sounds very paradoxical to say that, that I was uncomfortable with that, because in a way I feel that that's also part of this cult of the self, that...
Yes, agreed.
Yes, so I think in a way, because I went to the school where we were a very mixed kind of children who were just kids, we played in the playground, we studied in class. We didn't have the pressure of somehow finding your thing and finding your talent and excelling, that kind of thing. It was very much more on friendships and fights and plays, play and things like that. So in a way, I think part of it is this kind of extraordinary pressure that we put on ourselves and on every individual to somehow become, this extra person. And I think that there's a problem with that. And I feel that maybe this idea of just dampening down this idea of Utopia as that. With regard to this, the epistemic injustice, it is so much there, isn't it? And again, that's why I go back to this thing of actually sensitizing people to epistemic injustice is the way, in part, to do. I don't think it's that easy to undo, or even to value even this idea, as I said, very easy understanding that say, for example, Western is good and, non-Western is, Western is bad and non-Western is good, is just as problematic as the other way around. And I feel that there's sensitizing people to opening up their thinking, to questioning these things is the best that, is one way, I think, to think about this. That's maybe an inadequate, unsatisfactory answer, but that's, yeah.
I'll go to another question. I think that's the main bit here. So the microphone is just coming.
It's really difficult not to be able to see.
It is really blinded by the lights.
You talking? All right. Pass it on.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating, all your stories. I don't know if it's been brought up, the aspect of the commodity of education, about about it being a product with private schools. That's something that I think threads through all of this, and the opportunity that some kids have over others because of their backgrounds, in that sense. So I just wondered what your views on that are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I touched on it, but the education, as we know it, system, as we know it, was founded really, during the Industrial Revolution as a way of appeasing the Chartists, but also as a way of controlling this revolutionary thought that's going on. And as capitalism has increased and got more and more feral, children become more and more commoditized. That's, I really think about that. And there's no way we can have a utopia. We can't talk about education without talking about class, without talking about race and these things that work together to kind of to hold kids back, but also to commodify them. I don't know what you think.
I think we'll just have 2 more minutes for a final question. So the gentleman here at the front, and then Koumbou, this one is for you.
Hi, Stephen Watson. I'm a mathematician at the University of Glasgow. Just happened to be here at a math meeting and dropped in. I'm loving it. So I want to actually make a couple of statements, and I'm going to frame it through the story of the indigenous Americans, in particular the Blackfoot Native Americans of Montana, who have an excellent advocate. The name is Vine Deloria, who has a great book, We Talk, You Listen, which encodes the imposition of the language of power, in that case English, on the native tribes of North America. And just an anecdote, 20 years ago, they introduced indigenous language back into their elementary schools, and it revolutionized and transformed that society in a very positive way. So it echoes, indeed, the comment about decolonizing that we heard of earlier. So I want to make 2 comments as an educator. And that's an educator coming from Scotland, born 25 miles from here, where the language of home is something called Scots, not the language of education. And so I want to make 2 comments I think that are quite true. And the 2 comments would be that feeling and emotion, and that comes back to a point that was emphasized here as a mode of learning, is dislocated when the language of learning, especially in early years, is detached from the indigenous language. And so there are, of course, invisible differences. Most perhaps here may not understand Scots as an actual language that's spoken, but not written, disallowed to be written, essentially, in Scotland. And the other is, and this is an early years inspiration, the integration of learning, especially in the early years, is disrupted if the language of the classroom is not the language of the street and the home. So in some sense, what I'm sort of intrigued by, and I would like to sort of amplify here and get feedback, is the extent to which language and respecting it is part of that utopia. Because again, what's recognized, if the language of home is not recognized in the schooling, it's hard to argue that their voices are being heard. So maybe the guest online would be great to speak to that.
Thank you. Lovely, lovely comments. In my readings around Utopia, I very often found myself going back right to the beginning, where I started doing my PhD at Higher and Community Education in Moray House, just down the road here. And it was all about radical education and radical literacies and what this means. How your language is the language of the home and the street, and how it's disvalued, in the classroom. But Koumbou, I mean, you spoke about French, and we had a comment earlier also about the English. So I don't know, do you have any reflections on the significance of language itself?
Yes, thank you so much. I think really his comments are absolutely valuable, and for me as an African woman, and really from Fulani ethnic group, we just feel the same. We are educated in French, and it's difficult for a young Fulani to learn in French, and to get everything in this language. It is not his mother tongue, and it's the difficulty is, and all the researches are really shown with my last report as a UN special rapporteur, that it's difficult just for a kid, for his emotional and also his dignity, to be in this process, forced by using another language, because he can't have all the emotional but also the cultural understanding in this language when he is really learning. So for me, for good education, the quality of education must really begin with the mother tongue at the first level. And after, you can really add the other language, like French or Arabic or another, Spanish or any other. But in Africa, the most important challenge today for the quality of education, the question is not the access, the question is the quality. And many thinkers, like Professor Kizerbo or Sheikh Anta Diop, have absolutely right in many books on the history of education in Africa. And this is the most big challenge for African education today, really. For the quality of education, this question must be really be taken care. And when I was the Minister of Education, this is what I experimented in Burkina Faso, to use African language in the education system, really, from primary to secondary school. And even I earned a prize from UNESCO for this experience. Just to let you know, it's very, very important, because kids learn quickly and they are happy in the classroom for learning by using their mother tongue and their culture. Really, this is a great question, and I really thank you for raising this. I think for Utopia, this is really one leverage we must have, and I hope, this is my dream. Perhaps in Edinburgh, in Scotland, we will talk Fulani one day in the school of Scotland.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And it really nicely ties us in with the last part of today's event. The importance of language, the importance of the word. I think it was Paulo Freire who said, you need to read the word to be able to read the world. So with that, I'll just pass over to Sean Bain, who has been organizing these events, to introduce Joelle and her poem.
Thank you, Sotiria, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm just here to create a little sort of moment in between that incredible discussion and the reading that we're about to have from Joelle Taylor. My name's Sean Bain. I'm Professor of Digital Education here at Edinburgh University and one of the co-organisers of this series of Edinburgh Futures Conversations. So you've already met Joelle. She's working very hard for us this evening, because not only have you made this fabulous contribution to the panel, but she's now going to read one of the a specially commissioned poem that we asked her to write especially for this event. And we're having a poet speaking at each of the 3 Futures Conversations, which I think is hugely valuable for the way in which it kind of shifts the mood in the room, creates a point of pause and a moment of enables everyone to leave on a point of reflection. So as you already know, Joelle is one of our the UK's preeminent poets. Her her work is wonderful, it's critical, and when I read it, it always astonishes me, particularly this poem that she's written for tonight, actually, which I have seen an earlier version of. It beautifully encapsulates the research program that myself and a lot of colleagues have been working on at Edinburgh, but it encapsulates it in a very beautiful form that I think we can probably only aspire to as academics. So I think you'll enjoy this piece of work. The poem, it kind of takes us into some of the depths of current dystopias that we're living through, but then also gives us glimpses of the utopias that we very much need at the moment. So with that, Joelle, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. You've saved the need for a lengthy introduction. That's absolutely brilliant. So this poem is called The Conceptual Engineers, and it's responding to this idea of utopia and education in all kinds of different ways, but I'll just let the poem speak for itself. And it lasts 13 minutes exactly. Okay. 1. The year of hesitation. Good morning, children. Good morning, everybody. In the year of hesitation, when we knew but could not let go, when the only thing left to sell was ourselves, and nature was the space between tower blocks, before the climate changed us, when the turn of the engine was the turn of the sky, the truth is, we drowned before we drowned. And the next thing we knew, we were crowdfunding the end of the world, Instagramming apocalypse, renting air, drip-fed light, subscribing to sleep patterns. Such clever, dumb, such magnificent failure. Our pockets eating our hands, our houses haunting us. The world shrunk to the size of a flipped coin, infinite growth in a finite environment. Education was the waiting room between alive and useful, a field growing inward, each thought farm, harvested by the mills, the crop sown to feed the thin lips of the economy, the machinery of learning, chewing, digesting, and soon, our children were older than us, their hearts brass cogs. We watched them lining up neatly, smiling like watchmakers. 2, an industrial education. We glanced over our shoulders toward factories of thinking, and the children stored in rows, soft boxes on conveyor belts, ready to be wrapped, labeled, posted into the open mouths of utility. Every child quantum measured, a component part. And suddenly, we were mammon. We were bad money and bad breath. We were black glass. We were black grass and ghost oceans. We were noise, queuing politely for overstuffed cemeteries, every poem a bullet, every equation we set coming to the same number. Later, we thought, how strange. Our parents went to a place to learn, not realizing learning itself is a place. 3, the great unlearning. In the first year of the great unlearning, children sat in clinical rows, unblinking, awaiting the examination, a pulling back of hospital curtains to expose the mind, its awe and stasis, their pencils raised like horses approaching a high hedge, our needs infinite, our world a full stop floating in the black. The unlearning came quick. We asked the children, and they said, all we know is that singing bellies do not learn, and that is applied mathematics. All we know is the walk home follows you, and that is ancient history. When language escapes, that is contemporary literature, they said. They said, had we thought to reverse engineer the child? We traced the journey of an unopened face back to an empty plate, which led back to an empty pocket, which led back to an empty office, which led back to an empty application, an empty school desk, an empty plate. This, full stop. 4. The tower blocks of Babel. Without money, we were all wealthy. We migrated from the nucleus to single cells, multiplying at laptops across the city, each tower block a USB stick plugged into the circuitry of the streets, every window a digital monitor. We are everywhere. Everyone has a perfect view, but it keeps changing. Children wrestle the controls, program the sky to snow, to witness the Big Bang, to rupture cartoons, each of our devices holding hands across the tower blocks, watched over by the teacher, who adapts as we learn, who questions and reneges, sets lessons according to our levels, who synchronizes and monitors, translates and confronts, until educating stops teaching and begins to learn from us. The school sleeps, following the circadian patterns of those about to grow, to push their green faces through pages, replanting the books until a forest of thinking blossoms, each of their fruit, a child remembering their hands, astonished at their faces, how when one breathes in, the other breathes out. 5. The editors. Enter, stage left, pursued by bear and eagle. After fine-tuning the air and tightening the seas, after life became a popular app and the day came with a drop-down menu, we turned our attention to ourselves. What small turns of the screw could shine a dull child into brightness? What small seeds might reap the strongest thoughts? This is, they said, true democracy, though some of us could not afford the bigger thoughts in the better parts of philosophies. And soon, the untuned were left to babble. The world returned to yes and no. There was talk of revolution, though we were busy that day. But as technology sparked, so did we. 6. The conceptual engineers. The conceptual engineers gather in flocks, scattered across the globe. They consider each idea, make it whole, smooth to the touch, and we meet it out here in the metaverse. There's no need for books now that we are them. Each child a shelf in a vast library, the archive of the body, our DNA encoded, our understandings innate. There is no need to attend university now that everywhere is one. Lessons. 1. History. It's Wednesday, so it's history, which is, of course, biology. We meet in the firmament, in the space between body and idea, as the neural implant counts down in thick ghost font, until we're there, here, thigh deep in thick trenches, wading through some war that keeps repeating like a bad diet, our skin rearing at politicians' speeches, our hearts cauterizing. We enact orders we don't understand, feel our blood anthem become night. The implant, now a small emperor arguing with an empty room. Now the chattering of the ballot box, the shrug of borders. And now we are signing the Treaty of Versailles, the Magna Carta, the Balfour Declaration. And look, our pens point skyward, become rockets as we spiral to the moon, collecting carbon samples, strange music packed in tight boxes. And now we are light hitting a surface. Now we are prism. Lesson 2, geography. Maxine has discovered that though animals cannot see borders, humans could. They delineated cities, moats around ideas, lines around bodies, but the biggest wall was the one that no one could see, surrounding islands and continents, a sudden in the air. The birds dropped like ratings, a ship stubs itself, a plane ricochets into argument. But the walls did not stop there. They were inside people too, and soon no one could get a visa. Lesson 3, ecology. Christopher's learning how we used to build things that could not breathe, how we burned our lungs in vast bonfires, then tried to sell the smoke. We were police uncovering a corpse and arresting the flies. He switches his eyes to wide angle, witnesses the calcification of the countryside into fragile grey teeth that stretch their necks to bite at the sun, grey teeth that eat their inhabitants. Christopher trembles. Imagine that, he thinks. Imagine all the families carefully placed on top of each other, mothers on mothers on mothers, listening to hearts tick along corridors that constrict like throats, like futures. Christopher leans back, flicks off his eyes and wonders. How could they believe that selling the air would help them breathe? Lesson 4, politics. Angie's learning debate that disagreements used to be won or lost rather than solved. Her eyebrows raised like empires as she considers the past, as if it's something large approaching. She blinks and finds herself standing at the moment when everything fell, when money returned to paper and water became currency and land ran out of land. The moment we wondered what we were wondering for and who set the exams. When the revolution came, most of us were busy, turning parking lots into fields, apologising to the oceans. Ang notes the slow fade from supermarket queue to sustainability, the clink of coins sounding more and more like the rattling of chains. From wildfire thinking to creative cooperation. And though wars continue, they are ideological, taking place in an exhale, sudden and quiet things. It's difficult to truly hate a thing you understand. And without the concept of winning, wars have distilled to what they always were. Two people reaching for the same glass of water. 6. Our bodies grow outward from neural chips, our augmented memory shivering, our collective uncurling. We touch air, and it becomes geography, language, meaning. The past has never been more present, and now we know everything. We award marks not to who has the correct answer, but to how we found it, what it means, how each child cogs is part of the whole. And now we know the answers. We ask questions that we don't understand. And the children throw them in the air like red balloons, kicking the curiosity toward each other, keeping it afloat, afraid of what the ground knows. And then we join them, a vast white room trembling with red balloons, blood vessels in the body of our work. Inside each balloon is something we almost know. We can see their faces pressed to the skin, hear their susurrant. Education was never the answer. It was the question. Not so much teaching as unlearning, not so much road as map. We found that children score higher when we do not score them. Education is the opening of a window. Understanding is jumping out. Epilogue. Centuries later, we found the huddle of tower blocks sulking in the sadlands like teenagers, asking strangers for cigarettes. And we marvelled at their ritual purpose, how far the concrete had travelled, how it had poured itself here, just here, and at that time too. How many bodies were used in its construction? If the towers pointed to a celestial body with grey fingers, if so, what might live there, what it might want? And now, the tower blocks stand with their backs against each other, staring up at the cursor of the sun. Thank you.
God. Thank you so much, Joelle, for this 13 minutes of Utopia. I think you've just made a start. Thanks so much to our panelists. Thanks so much to all the producers of the event, to the organizers. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Please take some of these final words with you to reflect further on how we can actually use the word in order to understand the world, to change the world. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.